I was sipping my morning coffee on the deck of our lake cabin when I first spotted them, a group of strangers marching up our gravel pathway with a purpose that made my stomach knot. At the front was Karen Thompson, the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association, clutching a folder of papers to her chest like sacred texts. Behind her, 4 men carried what looked suspiciously like auction signs. Where are you watching this from? Comment below, because this story could happen anywhere in America. Trust me, the showdown that followed over the next few weeks was explosive, with an ending that will leave you completely satisfied. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter as I watched them approach, their faces set with a determination that suggested they believed they had every right to be here. What happens when a homeowners association thinks they have enough power to take away your family's most valuable property, and they have absolutely no idea that your mother is a federal judge with the authority to bring them down in seconds? The sun glinted off the calm surface of Lake Evergreen as I set my coffee down and stood up. Our cabin had been in the family for 3 generations, a rustic but charming 2-story log structure with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the water. My mother had inherited it from her parents and had spent every summer of her childhood here. Now it was our sanctuary, a place where Mom could escape the pressures of her job. I'd been staying there for the past month, working remotely while Mom came up on weekends. Neither of us had any idea that our peaceful retreat was about to become the center of a ridiculous power struggle. I remember thinking, as Karen's group came to a stop at the edge of our property, that this was going to be one of those stories people wouldn't believe when I told it later. Looking back, I was right, but for all the wrong reasons. "Good morning, Ms. Thompson," I called out, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the absurdity of the situation. "Can I help you with something?" Karen straightened her beige blazer and flipped her perfectly highlighted bob. Everything about her screamed suburban authority, from her pearl earrings to her sensible yet expensive shoes. She was in her 50s, with the kind of tan, taut skin that comes from regular appointments with the best dermatologist money can buy. The men behind her shuffled awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with whatever was about to happen. I recognized one of them as Bill from the HOA board, a usually friendly guy who was currently studying his shoes with intense interest. "I'm here on official HOA business," Karen announced, her voice carrying across the yard with practiced authority. "We've sent multiple notices regarding your overdue HOA fees, and as per our bylaws, we're now proceeding with property liquidation." I felt like I'd been dunked in the lake. The shock of her words was physically jarring. Property liquidation? Over HOA fees? I knew for a fact that Mom was meticulous about paying bills on time. As a federal judge, she understood better than most the importance of following rules and meeting obligations. This had to be some kind of mistake. But the smug look on Karen's face told me this wasn't a simple administrative error. This was something else entirely. "There must be a misunderstanding," I said, walking down from the deck to meet them at eye level. "My mother has paid all the HOA fees. I've seen the bank statements myself." Karen's smile didn't reach her eyes as she flipped open her folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. "According to our records, the Anderson property is 3 months behind on payments. We've sent 3 notices by mail, and as per Section 17.3 of the HOA covenant, we're authorized to auction the property to recover costs." Bill continued to study his shoes, and the other men shifted uncomfortably. Something was very wrong here. I reached for the paper, but Karen pulled it back slightly. "This is an official HOA document. I can show it to you, but I'll need it back." I took the paper and scanned it, my legal knowledge from years of dinner conversations with Mom immediately spotting several inconsistencies. The document claimed we owed nearly $3,000 in fees and penalties, but there was no breakdown of the charges, no reference to specific months missed, and the HOA covenant citation seemed suspiciously vague. "I'm going to need to discuss this with my mother," I said, pulling out my phone. "She's a stickler for documentation, and I'm certain there's been a mistake." Karen's smile tightened. "Of course, involve your mother, but the auction is scheduled for next Saturday, so if you want to resolve this, you'll need to do it quickly. Full payment of all fees and penalties is required to stop the process." As she spoke, one of the men unfurled a banner that read, Property auction, Saturday, 10 a.m. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about HOA fees at all. This was a land grab, pure and simple. Our cabin sat on one of the most desirable lots on the lake, with 200 feet of private shoreline and unobstructed sunset views. Property values had skyrocketed in the past year as city folks sought pandemic escapes. Karen had to know that an auction would attract wealthy buyers willing to pay far above market value for such a prime location. The question was, what did she stand to gain personally from forcing this sale? I took a deep breath, knowing that letting my anger show would only play into her hands. I'll need copies of all notices you claim to have sent, as well as a detailed accounting of these supposed overdue fees. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. We'll have those prepared for the meeting tomorrow evening. The HOA board will be discussing your case, and you and your mother are required to attend if you wish to contest this action. With that, she turned on her heel, and her entourage followed, leaving the auction banner staked into our front lawn like a declaration of war. I pulled it out as soon as they were out of sight, my hands shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. When they reached their cars, parked at the community dock, I saw Karen turn and look back at our cabin, a calculating expression on her face. In that moment, I knew this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple bank statement or proof of payment. This was going to be a battle. I immediately called my mother, trying to keep my voice calm as I explained the situation. Louise Anderson had been a federal judge for 15 years, and before that she'd been one of the top civil litigators in the state. Her response to my frantic explanation was unexpected, complete calm. Take photos of that banner and any documents they gave you, she said. Don't say anything else to Karen or anyone on the board until I get there. I'll leave the city now and should be there by dinner. Something in her tone made me pause. Mom, do you know something about this that I don't? There was a brief silence on the line. Let's just say I've been keeping an eye on our HOA for a while now. Karen Thompson has been playing little power games with several homeowners. I think it's time someone pushed back. By the time Mom arrived that evening, I'd done some reconnaissance of my own. I'd spoken to our nearest neighbor, Pete, an elderly man who'd lived on the lake for decades. His small, meticulously maintained cottage had been in his family since the 1950s, and he knew every inch of the lake and its history. We sat on weathered Adirondack chairs on his dock, the wood smooth from years of use, as the sun began its descent over the water. Pete's weathered face creased in concern as I explained our situation. That Karen's been a menace since she took over the HOA 2 years ago, he told me, shaking his head slowly. Used to be we had reasonable people running things. The HOA was there to keep the lake clean and settle the occasional dispute over noise or tree removal. Now it's like living under a dictator with a designer handbag. He took a sip from his coffee mug before continuing. Doubled the fees for lake maintenance, but the water quality's worse than ever. The algae bloom last summer was the worst I've seen in 30 years, but somehow there was no budget for treatment. Meanwhile, she's driving a new Mercedes. Pete gestured toward the community dock across the cove, started charging for parking at the community dock, which was always free for residents and guests, $20 a day, and God help you if your grass grows a half-inch too high, the fines are ridiculous. Sarah Miller, you remember her, the kindergarten teacher, got fined $250 because her mailbox was non-regulation color. It was white. Been white for 15 years. His indignation was palpable, but there was fear beneath it too. Pete lowered his voice despite the fact that we were alone, the gentle lapping of water against the dock the only sound besides our conversation. But here's the thing. Dan Lewis tried to fight back last year when she claimed he hadn't paid his fees. Dan's no pushover, retired attorney himself, but Karen had documentation that looked official enough. Next thing you know, his place is up for auction and some company from the city buys it for cash. 3 months later, they're tearing it down to build one of those massive vacation homes. All glass and steel, takes up every inch of the lot, and guess who's the real estate agent listing all these new properties? The pieces started coming together. Karen, I whispered. Pete nodded grimly. She's making a fortune in commissions on properties she basically stole from people who've owned them for generations. But nobody wants to fight her. She's got the board in her pocket, and most folks around here don't have the money for lawyers. I thanked Pete for the information and headed back to our cabin, my mind racing with implications. When Mom arrived, I filled her in on everything I'd learned. She listened attentively, unpacking her weekend bag with methodical precision. There was something reassuring about her calm demeanor, the way she processed information without visible reaction. I'd seen her prepare for cases this way, gathering facts, considering angles, planning several moves ahead. "I suspected something like this," she finally said, sitting down at our kitchen table with a cup of tea. "I've been hearing rumors about HOAs in vacation communities pulling similar stunts. It's particularly prevalent where there's a mix of long-time owners and wealthy newcomers." She pulled out her laptop and opened a folder labeled Lake HOA. My jaw dropped as I saw dozens of files, meeting minutes, financial statements, emails from other homeowners. "Mom, how long have you been collecting this?" She gave me a small smile. "Since Karen took over. You know me. I like to stay informed about things that could affect our property. I just never thought she'd be brazen enough to come after a federal judge." That's when I realized Mom hadn't been using her title in any HOA. Just as we were discussing our strategy for the meeting, the doorbell rang. It was Bill from the HOA board, looking nervous and holding an envelope. "I'm supposed to deliver this," he said, avoiding eye contact. "It's the second notice about the auction." Mom took the envelope with a polite smile. "Thank you, Bill. Will you be at the meeting tomorrow?" He nodded reluctantly. "Karen insists that all board members attend when there's an auction discussion." After he left, Mom opened the letter, which formally stated that due to continued non-compliance with HOA fee requirements, our property would be auctioned in 9 days. Mom read it carefully, then placed it on the table with a strange little smile. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "in all my years on the bench, I've seen many people try to manipulate the system. The smart ones cover their tracks well. Karen Thompson, I suspect, is not among the smart ones." The HOA meeting was held in the small community building near the lake. By the time Mom and I arrived, the room was already half full with other homeowners and the entire board seated at a long table at the front. Karen sat in the center, a position that clearly communicated her self-perceived importance. I noted that she wore a different expensive blazer today, navy with gold buttons, and her makeup was impeccable. Everything about her presentation was designed to convey authority and professionalism. As we took our seats, I saw several neighbors looking at us with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Word had clearly spread about the Anderson cabin being up for auction. Karen called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m., her voice carrying effortlessly through the room. "Before we address the general agenda items, we have a special case to discuss. The Anderson property, Lot 42, is currently scheduled for auction due to non-payment of HOA fees." She gestured toward us with a practiced expression of regret that didn't reach her eyes. "Ms. Anderson, would you like to address the board on this matter?" Mom stood up calmly, wearing what I recognized as her courtroom face. Pleasant, but unreadable. "Thank you, Ms. Thompson. I'd like to begin by clarifying that there has been no non-payment of fees from our property. I have here bank statements showing timely payments for every month in question." She approached the table and laid out 3 neatly organized papers. Karen barely glanced at them. "Our records indicate otherwise, and as I'm sure you're aware, the HOA's official records are what govern in these situations." Her dismissive tone made several people in the audience shift uncomfortably. Mom's expression didn't change. "I'd like to see these official records, please, including the specific accounting of what fees are allegedly unpaid." Karen signaled to another board member who passed her a folder. "As you can see here, we have no record of receiving your payments for March, April, or May of this year." Mom examined the documents carefully. "Interesting, because I have confirmation numbers for each payment processed through your online system. Perhaps there's been a technical error?" Karen's smile tightened. Our system is quite reliable, Miss Anderson, but even if there was a technical issue, it's the homeowner's responsibility to ensure payments are received. Section 17.3 of our covenant is quite clear about the consequences of non-payment. This was where I expected Mom to reveal her profession, to mention the legal problems with Karen's interpretation. Instead, she simply asked, "Could you please read the exact language of Section 17.3 for the record?" Karen looked annoyed but flipped through another folder. Section 17.3 states, "Failure to pay required HOA fees for a period exceeding 60 days shall result in penalties, including potential property liquidation, at the board's discretion." Mom nodded thoughtfully. "And when was this section last amended? Because my copy of the covenant, which was provided when we purchased the property 15 years ago, has significantly different language regarding fee enforcement." A murmur went through the room. Karen's face flushed slightly. "The board updated the covenant last year, as is our right. All homeowners were notified of the changes." Another homeowner in the audience, a woman in her 60s, stood up. "I never received any notification about covenant changes, especially nothing about auctioning properties." Karen pointed to a clause in the document. "Notice was provided in the quarterly newsletter. Continued ownership constitutes acceptance of updated terms." I could see Mom mentally cataloging every procedural violation, but her face remained pleasantly neutral. "I see. And may I ask what the starting bid will be for our property at this auction?" Karen's composure returned at the question. "The minimum bid will cover outstanding fees, penalties, and administrative costs, approximately $15,000. An audible gasp came from several audience members. Mom raised an eyebrow. "That seems quite high for 3 months of allegedly missed payments at $250 per month. Could you provide a breakdown of these costs?" Karen bristled. "The breakdown is in the documentation you'll receive prior to the auction. Now, unless you're prepared to pay the full amount tonight, I don't believe there's anything more to discuss." Mom stood her ground. "Actually, there is. I'd like the minutes to reflect that I contest both the alleged non-payment and the legality of the auction process itself. I've presented evidence of payment that the board has chosen to ignore. I'm formally requesting all records related to our property, all amendments to the covenant for the past 3 years, and all notices allegedly sent regarding our account." Karen's smile was ice cold. "You'll receive what you're legally entitled to, Ms. Anderson. But I should warn you, fighting the HOA rarely ends well for individual homeowners. Now, if there's nothing else, we have other matters to discuss." As we returned to our seats, I heard Karen add, almost as an afterthought, "Of course, if you're interested in avoiding this unpleasantness altogether, I'm sure we could find an alternative arrangement." The implied offer of a backroom deal hung in the air like smoke. Mom simply smiled enigmatically and said, "I'm sure we'll find a resolution, Miss Thompson. But you should know, you're playing with fire." As we left the meeting, several homeowners approached us, speaking in hushed tones about their own struggles with Karen and the current HOA regime. One couple had been fined repeatedly for unauthorized landscaping after planting native wildflowers instead of the approved grass. Another had fought a losing battle over a fence height variance that somehow other new properties had received without issue. Each story fit the same pattern: arbitrary enforcement, excessive penalties, and Karen at the center of it all. Back at the cabin, Mom finally let her professional mask slip. "That was worse than I expected," she admitted, kicking off her shoes and pouring herself a rare glass of whiskey. "She's not even trying to hide the corruption. Did you see how she brushed off legitimate questions? How the board members just sat there like decorative plants?" I nodded, still processing the brazenly unfair treatment we'd witnessed. "What's our next move? Do we pay the bogus fees just to make this go away?" Mom took a thoughtful sip of her drink. "That's exactly what she wants, for people to decide fighting isn't worth it. Pay up or give up your property." But she picked the wrong cabin this time. There was a steely determination in her voice that I knew well from childhood. It was the tone that meant someone had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Tomorrow I'm going to make some calls, Mom continued. I think it's time to bring in some colleagues. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through contacts. First, we need to document everything. Take photos of all our payment records, bank statements, the original covenant, anything related to the property or the HOA. As she spoke, an email notification pinged on her laptop. It was from the HOA, a formal notice that the auction would proceed as scheduled, with a reminder that full payment of $15,427.33 would be required to stop the proceedings. Mom forwarded the email to herself, then to an address I didn't recognize. Evidence, she explained simply. Karen is making this almost too easy. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Mom officially took a week of personal leave from her judicial duties, something she rarely did, and transformed our living room into a command center. She contacted former law colleagues, spent hours on phone calls, and meticulously organized evidence. I helped where I could, meeting with other homeowners to collect their stories and documentation. We discovered that in the past year alone, the HOA under Karen's leadership had attempted to force sales of 5 properties, 3 of which had gone through. Each time, the homes had been purchased by the same development company, Clearview Properties, and resold within months at significant markups. The pattern was undeniable. On the 3rd day, Mom hit pay dirt. She'd requested financial records for the HOA through a former colleague who specialized in property law, and what came back was illuminating. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a spreadsheet on her laptop. The HOAs received over $30,000 in consulting fees from Clearview Properties in the past year, and guess who sits on the board of Clearview? Karen's husband. I whistled low. That's a pretty obvious conflict of interest. Mom nodded grimly. It gets better. The HOA's financial records show all our payments were received and processed. They're claiming non-payment while their own records show otherwise. That's not just unethical, that's fraud. As we built our case, Karen became increasingly aggressive. Notices appeared on our door daily, each more threatening than the last. The language evolved from bureaucratic to almost personal, with one notice specifically mentioning that continued defiance of HOA authority will result in maximum penalties. I found Karen's SUV parked outside our cabin on 2 occasions, though she never knocked, just sat there watching the house for 20 minutes before driving away. It was clearly meant to intimidate, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't unnerve me a little. Other board members began avoiding eye contact when we saw them around the lake, scurrying away like frightened rabbits whenever Mom or I approached. One evening, I cornered Bill in the local grocery store, and the fear in his eyes was palpable. "I never wanted any of this," he whispered, glancing around nervously. "Karen controls everything, the finances, the meetings, the votes. Most of us are just trying to stay on her good side." When I pressed him for more information, he actually flinched. "I can't. My wife's business gets all its clients through Karen's social circle. She'd destroy us." He hurried away, leaving his shopping basket behind in his haste to escape. But most disturbing was what happened to Pete, our elderly neighbor who had spoken to me about Karen's schemes. He received an emergency violation notice, claiming his dock didn't meet safety standards and needed $5,000 in immediate repairs. When he protested, a second notice arrived threatening daily fines of $100 until the violation was addressed. The next day, Pete found his boat untied and drifting in the lake with minor damage to the hull that would cost hundreds to repair. There was no proof of who had done it, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidence. When he called the local sheriff, he was told that without evidence there was nothing they could do. It was clear intimidation, and it made my blood boil. I wanted to confront Karen directly, to call out her obvious attacks, but Mom counseled patience. She remained eerily calm throughout each escalation. "They're getting desperate," she observed as we documented each new incident in our growing file. "They know something's different this time. Predators are most dangerous when cornered, and make no mistake, Karen knows she's being cornered." On Thursday, 3 days before the scheduled auction, Karen organized an emergency HOA meeting. The email notification claimed it was to review auction procedures and address community concerns. But the real purpose became clear the moment we arrived. The room was packed with unfamiliar faces, wealthy-looking couples in expensive casual wear who I'd never seen around the lake before. Potential buyers, I realized with a jolt. Karen was parading them through before the auction, stirring up interest in our property. She stood at the front of the room with a realtor's smile, pointedly ignoring us as we took seats in the back. As many of you know, we have a prime waterfront property coming up for auction this Saturday, Karen announced, her voice honey-sweet. Lot 42 features 200 feet of private shoreline, original log cabin construction with potential for expansion, and unobstructed sunset views. The starting bid will be a mere $15,000, though the property is valued at approximately $850,000. A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd of strangers. Karen continued, "This is a rare opportunity to acquire lake property at a fraction of market value. The current owners have failed to meet their community obligations, and the HOA covenant clearly allows for this type of sale to recover costs." The blatant misrepresentation made my jaw clench, but Mom placed a warning hand on my arm. After the presentation, Karen opened the floor for questions. Most came from potential buyers asking about property details, but one longtime resident stood up. "I'm confused about how a property can be auctioned for HOA fees without going through regular foreclosure channels. Is this legal?" Karen's smile never faltered. "The HOA covenant gives us this authority, and all homeowners agreed to these terms. It's perfectly legitimate under state property laws." That's when Mom finally made her move. She stood up slowly, and something in her posture made the room go quiet. "Actually, Ms. Thompson, I believe you're mistaken about the law. Perhaps you could cite the specific state statute that gives HOAs auction authority without court oversight?" Karen's smile froze. "I'm not a lawyer, Ms. Anderson, but our HOA attorney has assured us of our legal standing." Mom nodded thoughtfully. "That's interesting, because as a federal judge with jurisdiction over civil property disputes, I find your interpretation highly questionable." The room went completely silent. Karen's face drained of color so rapidly I thought she might faint. "A federal judge?" she repeated, her voice suddenly weak. Mom smiled pleasantly. "Yes, Judge Louise Anderson, United States District Court. I've been somewhat fascinated by your novel interpretation of property law, but I believe it's time to correct the record for everyone present." With practiced courtroom precision, Mom addressed the room. "For those of you considering bidding on our property, I should inform you that this auction is the subject of a pending legal investigation. Any transactions made would likely be invalidated, and participants could potentially be implicated in a fraud case." The prospective buyers began shifting uncomfortably, some even standing to leave. "Furthermore," Mom continued, "I've filed emergency injunctions this morning to halt any property transfers authorized by this HOA, pending a complete audit of their financial practices and covenant amendments." Karen finally found her voice. "You can't do that. You have no jurisdiction over—" "I assure you, Ms. Thompson, I have precisely the jurisdiction needed," Mom interrupted, her voice velvet over steel. "But even if I didn't, the federal authorities who received my evidence of wire fraud, document falsification, and embezzlement certainly do." She turned to address the stunned audience. "For those who actually live in this community, I apologize that this meeting has been co-opted for inappropriate purposes. I suggest we reconvene next week to discuss the formation of a new HOA board, one that actually represents homeowners' interests." With that bombshell dropped, Mom calmly sat down beside me. Karen stood frozen at the front of the room, her perfect composure shattered as potential buyers streamed toward the exits. What happened next unfolded with the swift precision of long-planned justice. The following morning, representatives from the county clerk's office arrived, with formal notices halting any property transfers initiated by the HOA. By afternoon, 2 agents from the State Financial Crimes Unit were interviewing board members. who suddenly seemed eager to distance themselves from Karen's schemes. Pete and other neighbors brought out lawn chairs to watch as Karen was served with multiple subpoenas, her face a mask of disbelief and growing panic. Some residents even brought coolers with drinks and snacks, turning the moment into something of an impromptu block party. "Been waiting 3 years to see this," Pete told me with undisguised glee, raising his can of lemonade in a mock toast. "Your mother is a damn hero around here now." I couldn't help but smile at the collective sense of relief that permeated the gathering. For many of these people, Karen's reign of HOA terror had been a constant source of stress and financial worry. Watching her finally face consequences felt like a community-wide exhale. The auction signs disappeared from our property overnight, replaced by a simple notice that the event had been indefinitely postponed due to legal complications. I took particular pleasure in removing that sign myself later, reclaiming our property symbolically as well as legally. Karen made one last desperate attempt to save herself as her carefully constructed world began crumbling around her. She appeared at our door on Friday evening, the golden sunset, creating an almost theatrical backdrop for her final performance. Gone was the power suit and commanding presence. Instead, she wore a simple blouse and pants, her hair pulled back in a modest ponytail rather than her usual perfect blowout. All traces of her former arrogance had vanished, replaced by a carefully crafted mask of contrition. I answered the door, immediately feeling a surge of anger at the sight of her standing on our porch, but curiosity won out. What possible play could she have left? I called for Mom, who appeared beside me with a calmly expectant expression, as though she had been waiting for this inevitable visit. "Louise, Judge Anderson, I think we've had a serious misunderstanding," Karen began, her voice trembling slightly, hands clasped before her in a gesture almost reminiscent of prayer. "I wanted to come and speak with you directly, person to person, woman to woman." She paused, clearly hoping for some sign of receptiveness, but Mom's face remained impassive. Karen pressed on, her voice taking on a practiced note of sincerity that might have been convincing to someone who hadn't witnessed her true nature. "The board was simply following procedures that were in place before I became president. I inherited a system with flaws, and I've done my best to administer it fairly. If there have been errors in your case or others, they were honest mistakes, not malicious actions. We're all volunteers, after all, trying to maintain our beautiful community." The audacity of her attempt to rewrite history was breathtaking. Mom listened politely, arms crossed, allowing Karen to spin her tale of innocent misunderstandings and bureaucratic missteps. Karen grew more animated as she spoke, perhaps mistaking Mom's silence for receptiveness. "I'm sure if we look at everything objectively, we can find a solution that works for everyone without involving courts and investigations. As neighbors, surely we can work this out reasonably." She even attempted a warm smile, though it didn't reach her eyes, which remained calculating even in her moment of feigned humility. When Karen finally finished her plea, the silence stretched between them for a long moment, broken only by the distant call of birds from the lake. Mom simply said, "You tried to steal our family home through falsified documents, Karen." Her voice was calm but carried an unmistakable weight of judgment. "You've done the same to other families. You've abused your position of trust in this community to enrich yourself at the expense of your neighbors. These weren't mistakes. They were calculated criminal actions carried out over years with clear intent and pattern." She gestured toward our cabin, the home that had been in our family for generations. "This place represents more than property to us. It's where my parents brought me as a child, where I taught my own child to swim, where we've celebrated holidays and mourned losses. You were willing to take that away based on a lie, all for profit." Mom's eyes, usually warm, had taken on the penetrating quality I'd seen her use in the courtroom. "And unlike your HOA meetings, in my courtroom evidence actually matters. Intentions matter, patterns of behavior matter, and the evidence against you is overwhelming on all counts." Karen's facade cracked entirely, the carefully cultivated image of confident authority dissolving before our eyes. Her voice dropped to a desperate whisper. "Please, you don't understand what this will do to me, to my family. What do you want? Money? I can make this right. I have connections. I can make sure you get preferential treatment on any lake regulations for years to come. We can come to some arrangement that stays out of the courts. Her hands were actually trembling as she reached into her purse and pulled out a checkbook. Name your price, whatever you think is fair for the misunderstanding. The desperation in her voice was palpable, but there was something else too, a fundamental inability to grasp that some things couldn't be fixed with money or influence. This was a woman who had never faced real consequences, who had always found a way to manipulate or buy her way out of trouble. Mom stood perfectly still, her expression a mixture of pity and resolve. She shook her head slowly. That's exactly the problem, Karen. You think everything can be bought or manipulated. You think rules are for other people. You think that if you just find the right price, the right leverage, you can make your problems disappear. She gestured toward the checkbook in Karen's hand. Put that away. It's insulting to both of us. What you've done isn't a misunderstanding. It's a pattern of deliberate fraud that has hurt real people, people who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. Some of them lost homes that had been in their families for generations because of your schemes. Karen started to protest, but Mom held up a hand, silencing her with the same authority she commanded in her courtroom. The legal system doesn't work the way your HOA does. There's no private arrangement that can fix this. The appropriate authorities have the evidence, and the process will follow its course. Karen's shoulders slumped in defeat as the reality of her situation finally seemed to sink in. She turned to leave, the confident stride that had carried her through our community now reduced to the hesitant steps of someone seeing their carefully constructed world crumbling around them. As she reached the door, Mom added quietly, "The law isn't something to be wielded for personal gain, Karen. It isn't a weapon for the powerful to use against those with less resources or knowledge. It exists to protect people, even from people like you, perhaps especially from people like you." The door closed behind Karen with a soft click, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive perfume and the lingering heaviness of a predator finally facing justice. The following week brought sweeping changes to our lakeside community that felt like watching a small revolution unfold. An emergency meeting was called at the community building, but unlike previous HOA gatherings dominated by Karen's authoritarian presence, this one had the energy of a true democratic assembly. The room was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the porch. Longtime residents who had stopped attending meetings years ago emerged from their cabins, eager to reclaim their community. For the first time, I saw genuine hope on the faces of our neighbors. The vote to dissolve the current HOA board was unanimous, people practically leaping to their feet when the motion was presented. The selection of new representatives became something of a celebration, with nominations called out enthusiastically and candidates promising transparency and fair treatment. Pete, despite his initial reluctance, was persuaded to take a position on the new board. "I'm too old for this nonsense," he grumbled, even as he accepted the role with poorly concealed pride. "But I suppose somebody's got to make sure we don't end up with another Karen." A woman named Maria, whose family had owned property on the lake for generations but who had remained quiet during Karen's reign, stepped forward to serve as the new president. Her first act was to propose a complete revision of the HOA covenant, returning it to its original purpose of community support rather than control. Meanwhile, the legal machinery set in motion by Mom's actions ground forward with methodical precision. Financial records were seized as part of the expanding investigation, each new revelation more damning than the last. Karen and her husband had pocketed nearly $200,000 from their property schemes. Money skimmed from inflated HOA fees, kickbacks from Clearview Properties, and consulting payments that were nothing more than bribes. The paper trail was so clear that the prosecutor assigned to the case reportedly remarked that it was the most straightforward fraud case I've seen in years. 3 families who had lost their homes to suspicious auctions were contacted by investigators, with discussions of potential restitution underway. Dan Lewis, the retired attorney who had lost his cabin in the first of Karen's property schemes, became a central figure in organizing the affected homeowners, his legal experience proving invaluable in navigating the complex process of seeking justice. Perhaps most satisfying on a personal level was Pete's revelation that his dock violation had been magically resolved without him needing to make any changes or payments. The new HOA board issued him a formal letter of apology, acknowledging that the citation had been without merit and assuring him that his property was in full compliance with all legitimate regulations. First piece of mail from the HOA in years that didn't make my blood pressure spike, he told me with a grin, waving the letter like a victory flag as we shared coffee on his supposedly non-compliant dock. As for Karen, her reputation and carefully constructed facade of respectability collapsed overnight with a speed that was almost breathtaking to witness. The woman who had ruled our community with imperious confidence was now a pariah. Her real estate license was suspended pending the fraud investigation, cutting off her primary source of income and professional identity in one decisive blow. The local real estate community, once her power base, quickly distanced themselves from her. Former colleagues who had once laughed at her jokes and sought her approval now refused to return her calls, unwilling to risk association with her tainted name. Clearview Properties found itself under scrutiny from state regulators, with questions being raised about how many of their other developments had been acquired through similar tactics. Their stock price took a significant hit as investors grew nervous about potential legal exposure. Most devastating for someone who had built her life around social status and the perception of success, Karen and her husband suddenly found themselves unwelcome in the community they had tried to reshape in their image. Their invitations to social events mysteriously disappeared. The country club where they had prominently displayed their membership suddenly found issues with their account. Former friends crossed the street to avoid interactions. I witnessed one such moment at the local grocery store, where a group of women who had once been Karen's loyal social circle turned and walked in the opposite direction when they spotted her coming down the aisle. The look of humiliation on her face was palpable even from a distance. It was a harsh punishment, this social exile, but one entirely of her own making. They put their lake house on the market within days, unable to face the daily reminder of their fall from grace. The listing was notably absent from local real estate publications, relegated instead to an online posting that described the property in glowing terms that made no mention of the community they were fleeing. The asking price was predictably inflated, reflecting either financial desperation or a continued inability to reckon with reality. But with the cloud of scandal hanging over it, there were no takers. I drove past occasionally and noticed the for sale sign gradually weathering in the elements, a visual representation of their fading prospects. After 2 months, the price was slashed by 20%, then again by another 15% a month later. Still, no buyers emerged. It seemed fitting somehow that the woman who had sought to force others from their homes now couldn't escape her own. On a perfect summer evening, about a month after the confrontation, Mom and I sat on our dock, legs dangling over the edge with toes occasionally dipping into the cool water below. The lake stretched before us, still and reflective as a mirror, perfectly capturing the sunset that painted the sky in magnificent shades of gold, pink, and deep purple. The distant sound of children's laughter carried across the water from somewhere down the shore, and the occasional splash of a fish jumping created expanding rings on the glassy surface. After weeks of tension and legal maneuvering, the peaceful scene felt like a hard-won victory in itself. I leaned back on my hands, feeling the smooth, sun-warmed wood of the dock beneath my palms. "You know," I said, swirling the ice in my lemonade and watching the light catch in the glass, "you could have shut Karen down immediately. One phone call, one letter on judicial letterhead. You could have identified yourself as a federal judge from the beginning and probably scared her off our property at least. Why did you let it play out so long?" The question had been nagging at me since the confrontation. While I understood the satisfaction of seeing Karen's schemes fully exposed, the stress of those weeks had been considerable. There had been moments when I genuinely feared we might lose our beloved cabin despite knowing the law was on our side. Mom smiled, her eyes on the horizon where the sun was making its final descent, casting long golden rays across the water. The light caught the silver in her hair, reminding me that for all her strength and authority, she wasn't getting any younger. This cabin meant as much to her as it did to me, perhaps more, given the lifetime of memories it held for her. 2 reasons, she said finally, her voice thoughtful. First, I needed enough evidence to stop not just the auction of our cabin but her entire operation. If I'd only focused on our property, if I'd simply pulled rank and scared her off, she would have moved on to someone else's home. Maybe Pete's, maybe that nice young couple that just bought the A-frame down the shore. Someone without my resources or knowledge of the law. She took a thoughtful sip of her drink, ice clinking against the glass. The predator would have just found easier prey. I couldn't let that happen, not when I had the ability to stop it completely. Mom had always had a strong sense of justice, a belief that her legal knowledge came with responsibility. It was why she'd become a judge in the first place, passing up more lucrative opportunities in private practice. And second, she continued, watching a heron glide low over the water in the distance, sometimes people need to reveal their true character in their own time, in their own words. Pushing too hard too fast can make even the guilty appear sympathetic, like they're being bullied or trapped. I needed everyone to see exactly who Karen was, what she was doing, and how deliberately she was doing it. Karen needed enough rope to thoroughly hang herself, and she did, spectacularly, in front of the entire community. I nodded, understanding the wisdom in her approach. The new HOA board seems promising. They're already talking about rolling back all those ridiculous rule changes. Mom smiled. Community governance works when it's actually about the community, not personal power. I think we'll be okay now. As the last rays of sun disappeared behind the trees, I reflected on how close we'd come to losing this place, this sanctuary that held generations of family memories. Never underestimate the power of knowing your rights, Mom said quietly, seeming to read my thoughts. And never underestimate the power of standing up to bullies, especially when they hide behind official-sounding titles and rules they've written themselves. That night, as fireflies began to dot the darkness around our cabin and the chorus of frogs and crickets provided nature's soundtrack, I settled into a rocking chair on the porch with a fresh cup of tea. Mom joined me shortly, wrapping a light blanket around her shoulders against the evening chill. For a long while we simply sat in companionable silence, rocking gently and watching the light from inside the cabin cast long, warm rectangles onto the lawn. I couldn't help but feel a profound appreciation for the justice that had prevailed, not just for us, but for the entire community. The cabin creaked softly around us, a sound I'd known since childhood, the settling of old wood, the whispers of a structure that had sheltered generations of my family. It was more than property. It was a repository of memories, the physical embodiment of our family's history. Karen had counted on people being too intimidated, too busy, or too isolated to fight back against her schemes. She had banked on ignorance, homeowners not understanding their rights or the proper procedures for HOA governance. She had exploited fear, the worry that fighting back would only make things worse. And she had taken advantage of isolation, the fact that each victim believed they were alone in their struggle against her authority. But she had never anticipated that her carefully selected target would turn out to be someone who understood the law better than she ever could. Someone with the resources and determination to not only defend themselves, but to expose the entire corrupt system she had created. "I've been thinking about Dan Lewis," Mom said suddenly, breaking our comfortable silence. Dan, the retired attorney who'd lost his cabin in Karen's first fraudulent auction. I spoke with him yesterday. He's considering buying back his old property now that the current owners are looking to sell in the wake of the scandal. She smiled softly at the thought. He said his grandchildren still ask when they're going back to the lake house. They don't understand why it was taken away. Will he be able to get it back, I asked, feeling a surge of hope for this man I'd never met, but whose story had become intertwined with ours. It's complicated, Mom admitted. The current owners aren't at fault. They were misled too, but they're willing to negotiate, especially since the community's support is firmly behind Dan. I've put him in touch with some colleagues who specialize in property recovery cases. She took a sip of her tea. It won't undo what happened, but it's a start. As we continued rocking in the darkness, I reflected on how differently things might have gone if Karen had targeted someone else's cabin, someone without Mom's legal knowledge and authority. So many others might have lost their homes, their family histories, their connections to this land and water. There was a certain poetic justice in the fact that Karen's undoing came from selecting exactly the wrong victim. It was a reminder that no matter how clever the manipulation or how bold the theft, eventually the truth finds its way to the surface when someone is willing to stand firm and fight back. The lake water lapped gently at the shore below, a constant soothing presence. Overhead, stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, their reflections dancing on the water's surface. As Mom had said in that pivotal moment at the meeting that changed everything, priceless property with the right to peacefully enjoy it might be worth more than any amount of money in the bank for most families. But family and justice? That's something you can't put a price tag on. And looking around at our beloved cabin, secure once more from threat, I knew without doubt that we had won something far more valuable than just a legal battle. We had protected a legacy, preserved a community, and perhaps most importantly, reminded everyone that even the most powerful bullies can be defeated when people stand together for what's right.